In 2017, the United States Treasury signed an executive order that would send shockwaves through the global oil market. Overnight, Venezuela's oil industry, the engine of its economy and the source of 90% of its export revenue, was frozen out of the world's financial system. U.S. banks were banned from buying new Venezuelan bonds. Oil tankers sat idle in the Caribbean, unable to find buyers. Billions in assets were blocked. The world's energy map shifted in a matter of weeks. Inside Caracas, the panic was immediate. Gasoline lines stretched for miles. Blackouts rolled through the capital. The Bolivar collapsed. On the streets, families traded cooking oil for diesel, and the price of bread doubled in a month. In the boardrooms of PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company, executives watched as their lifeline to the world was cut. Oil production, once among the highest in OPEC, fell by more than half in just 3 years. But the shock didn't stop at Venezuela's borders. In Houston, traders scrambled to reroute crude supplies. In Beijing and Moscow, diplomats saw an opening. China and Russia stepped in with loans, technology, and secret oil deals, often paid for in yuan, rubles, or gold. Indian refiners quietly bought discounted Venezuelan crude, using intermediaries and shadowy shipping networks. The world's oil flows bent around the sanctions, but the price was chaos. A single executive order had turned oil into a global weapon. The U.S. hoped to force regime change in Caracas. Instead, it triggered a scramble for influence that redrew alliances from the Caribbean to the South China Sea. The emotional echo was immediate. The oil embargoes of the 1970s, the panic of 1929, the uncertainty of every modern energy crisis. Each time, leaders promised containment. Each time, the shockwaves spread further. How did sanctions on one country send shockwaves through every market? Why did a barrel of oil become the world's most dangerous currency? The answer is in the way oil, money, and power are now fused together. Each move in one market triggers a reaction in another. But to see how oil became the world's most dangerous currency, we need to go back to the roots of Venezuela's rise and fall. In 1922, a geyser of oil erupted from the ground at La Rosa, near Lake Maracaibo. The roar was heard for miles. Within a decade, Venezuela was transformed from a sleepy agricultural nation into the world's second-largest oil exporter. Foreign companies, Shell, Exxon, Gulf, rushed in, building refineries, ports, and entire towns in the jungle. The smell of crude oil became the scent of modernity. By the 1950s, Caracas was a city of neon lights and skyscrapers. The country's highways were lined with Cadillacs and American diners. Oil money paid for schools, hospitals, and the best infrastructure in Latin America. Venezuela's leaders boasted that their nation was Saudi Arabia with palm trees. The world called it a miracle. But the miracle had a dark side. The economy became addicted to oil. Coffee, cocoa, and agriculture faded. The government grew fat on royalties and taxes, but the wealth was uneven. Corruption flourished. The poor remained poor. The term resource curse was born, the paradox that nations with the most natural wealth often end up the most unstable. In 1976, Venezuela nationalized its oil industry, creating PDVSA, one of the world's largest state oil companies. The move was hailed as a victory for sovereignty. Oil profits soared. The government created a sovereign wealth fund promising to save for the future, but spending outpaced saving. Politicians used oil money to buy votes, fund grand projects, and paper over economic cracks. Venezuela was a founding member of OPEC, the oil cartel that would shape global prices for decades. The country's voice mattered in Riyadh, Tehran, and Moscow. Oil was not just a commodity, it was a lever of power, but the seeds of collapse were sown in the very years of plenty. When oil prices fell in the 1980s, Venezuela's debts ballooned. The government devalued the Bolivar, cut subsidies, and faced riots in the streets. The emotional echo was clear. Boom turned to bust, and the promise of oil became a trap. How did oil turn Venezuela into a global power and a ticking time bomb? Why did the world's richest oil nation end up in crisis? The answer is in the way oil wealth can build an empire, and then hollow it out from within. But the seeds of collapse were sown in the very years of plenty. In 1998, Hugo Chavez swept to power on a wave of anger and hope. Venezuela's oil riches had made a few families fabulously wealthy, but left millions in poverty. Chavez, a former paratrooper who had once led a failed coup, promised a revolution, oil for the people, not for the elite. He moved fast. Oil was nationalized again in spirit, if not in law. PDVSA, once a technocratic giant, became an arm of the state. Revenues were funneled into social programs, health clinics, subsidized food, new schools. The poor cheered as the Bolivarian Revolution promised dignity and justice. But Chavez's vision was bigger than Venezuela. He used oil as a weapon and a lifeline. Cheap fuel was shipped to Cuba and Caribbean neighbors in exchange for political loyalty. PetroCaribe became a tool of petrodiplomacy, buying friends and influence across the hemisphere. At OPEC meetings, Chavez pushed for higher prices, tighter quotas, and a united front against the West. The world watched as Venezuela's oil boom funded a new order, but the warning signs were there. As oil prices soared in the 2000s, the government spent even faster. Imports flooded in. Local industry withered. The bolivar was pegged high, making foreign goods cheap and domestic production uncompetitive, a classic case of Dutch disease. Corruption flourished. PDVSA's output began to slip as political appointees replaced engineers. The state borrowed against future oil, mortgaging tomorrow for today's popularity. The emotional echo was unmistakable, the pride of a nation finally in control, the fear that the foundation was built on sand. How did oil become both a weapon and a lifeline? What happens when a nation bets everything on a single resource? The answer is a cycle as old as empire. Boom, pride, overreach, and the first cracks of collapse. But when oil prices crashed, the revolution's foundation began to crack. In 2014, the price of oil collapsed. From over $100 a barrel, crude plunged to less than $30. For Venezuela, it was a death sentence. The country's entire economy was built on oil. Suddenly, the cash stopped flowing. The government slashed imports. Supermarket shelves emptied. Hospitals ran out of medicine. The lights went out, literally. Blackouts rolled through Caracas and Maracaibo. The world's largest oil reserves couldn't keep the pumps running. The government printed money to fill the gap. The bolivar became worthless. Hyperinflation took hold. Prices doubled every few weeks. A cup of coffee cost a month's salary. Families carried stacks of bills to buy bread. The middle class vanished. The poor starved. The rich fled. Then came the sanctions. In 2017, the U.S. Treasury banned American banks from buying new Venezuelan bonds. In 2019, the U.S. froze PDVSA's assets and blocked oil exports to the U.S. European banks followed. The world's financial arteries closed. Oil tankers sat idle. Refineries shut down. The government turned to the black market, selling crude through intermediaries, ghost tankers, and secret deals with China and Russia. The emotional echo was brutal. The panic of 1929, the chaos of Weimar Germany, the collapse of every petrostate that bet everything on a single resource. Each time, leaders promised containment. Each time, the crisis spread further. How did a nation with the world's largest oil reserves run out of gasoline? Why did sanctions turn a crisis into a catastrophe? The answer is in the way global finance, energy, and politics are now fused together. Each move in one market triggers a reaction in another. But as Venezuela fell, new players moved in, and the oil war went global. By 2020, Venezuela's oil no longer flowed to Houston or Rotterdam. The world's toughest sanctions had forced the country's crude into the shadows. But oil, like water, finds a way. In the ports of Malaysia, Singapore, and the Caribbean, tankers with their transponders, switched off, so-called ghost ships, waited for midnight cargo swaps. Barrels changed hands in the dark, paperwork rewritten, origins blurred. China became Venezuela's lifeline. State-owned refiners in Shandong quietly bought millions of barrels, often at steep discounts, paid for in yuan, gold, or even cryptocurrency. Russian traders acted as middlemen, blending Venezuelan crude with other grades to disguise its source. Indian refiners, hungry for cheap oil, joined the game, using intermediaries to skirt U.S. restrictions. The shadow market thrived. Billions of dollars moved through offshore accounts, shell companies, and digital wallets. The term sanctions evasion became a daily reality. The petrodollar ADS grip loosened as more deals were settled in yuan, the rise of the petro-yuan. For the first time, the world's most important commodity was being traded outside the dollar's reach. Sanctions on Russia after the invasion of Ukraine sent shockwaves through oil and gas markets. OPEC Plus cut production, tightening supply just as demand rebounded. Venezuela's shadow exports, once a trickle, became a lifeline for Asian buyers. The price of oil soared past $120 a barrel. Gasoline hit record highs in California and Berlin. The world's leaders scrambled for answers. In Brussels, European officials raced to sign new gas deals with Qatar, Algeria, and the US. LNG terminals sprang up on the North Sea. In Paris, the lights of the Eiffel Tower were dimmed to save power. In Washington, the White House released millions of barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, but the relief was short-lived. Inflation surged, food prices spiked, political anger boiled over. The term energy security returned to the headlines. Nations that once took cheap oil for granted now faced a new reality. Every barrel was a bargaining chip. Supply shocks became the new normal. The geopolitical risk premium was priced into every contract. Traders watched not just for hurricanes or refinery fires, but for tweets from Moscow, Riyadh, or Caracas. How did a crisis in Caracas drive up prices in California and Berlin? What happens when energy becomes the world's most valuable and volatile weapon? The answer is in the way oil, politics, and money are now fused together. Each move in one market triggers a reaction in another. The oil war is redrawing alliances and rewriting the rules of global power. In 1956, the Suez crisis erupted when Egypt nationalized the canal, triggering a military response from Britain, France, and Israel. The world watched as oil tankers were blocked, prices spiked, and the old empires were forced to retreat, not by armies, but by the threat of U.S. financial pressure and a run on the British pound. The lesson was clear. Oil was no longer just a commodity. It was a lever of global power. Fast forward to the 1970s. OPEC's oil embargo sent shockwaves through the West. Gas lines stretched for miles. Inflation soared. The U.S. responded by striking a deal with Saudi Arabia, birthing the petrodollar system. Oil profits were recycled into U.S. treasuries, funding America's deficits and cementing the dollar's dominance. The world learned that energy and money were now inseparable. Today, the tools and players have changed, but the game remains the same. Sanctions, not blockades, are the new weapon. The US and EU freeze assets, block exports, and target financial networks. Russia, Iran, and Venezuela turn to shadow markets, cryptocurrency, and barter. China's Belt and Road Initiative builds new pipelines and ports, creating alternative routes and alliances. The term energy transition is on every leader's lips, but the reality is that oil and gas still decide the fate of nations. The emotional echo is unmistakable. The panic of Suez, the chaos of the 1970s, the uncertainty of today's sanctions era, each time, leaders promise energy security. Each time, the world discovers how fragile that security really is. Are today's oil wars just history repeating, or a new kind of conflict? What did past crises teach that today's leaders keep forgetting? The answer is that every attempt to control oil, by force, by finance, or by law, has ended in deeper entanglement. The US-Venezuela oil war is not just a story of sanctions and tankers. It's a warning, etched in the price of gasoline, the blackout of a city, the collapse of a currency, about how resources shape empires and how fragile the world's systems really are. Every era has its oil war. In the 1950s, the Suez crisis showed that a single canal could bring empires to their knees. In the 1970s, OPEC's embargo proved that a handful of nations could hold the world hostage. In the 2020s, sanctions and shadow markets have turned every barrel into a bargaining chip, every contract into a battlefield. The emotional echo is timeless. The pride of a nation flush with oil, the pain of collapse, the shock of waking up to new rules, the panic of 1929, the chaos of 1973, the uncertainty of every modern energy crisis. Each time, leaders promise stability. Each time, the world discovers how quickly stability can vanish. Will you be ready when the next oil war erupts? Will you recognize the signals before the headlines hit? The answers are hidden in the past, if you know where to look. Don't assume the rules of energy and power are set in stone. Watch for the signals: rising debt, sudden deals, the quiet transfer of strategic assets. Pay attention to the canaries, gold flows, new alliances, and the fine print in every contract. In every reset, someone is early, someone is late, and someone never even realizes a reset happened. Will you be ready when the next shock comes? Will you recognize the signals before the headlines hit? Subscribe for more cinematic economic history and learn how to spot the next global energy shock before it hits.